times, what a man does not say is more important than the words he chooses. But the few words he does offer, when spoken from emotional distance, can tell you everything you need to know, not about him, but about yourself, about where you are still hoping, still waiting, still trying to water a garden that is not yours to tend. In moments like these, silence is not the absence of love. It is the presence of resistance. And when resistance speaks, it speaks in fragments, delayed messages, uncertain futures, gentle detours away from intimacy. You must learn to hear the truth behind the tone, not just the tone behind the truth. There is a saying in Eastern thought, the river does not resist the stone, it flows around it. In relationships, emotional availability is the river. It either flows freely or it diverts itself around obstacles, work, silence, indecision, or even kindness spoken at a distance. What many people fail to see is that emotional unavailability rarely arrives with anger, rudeness, or aggression. It often arrives quietly, cloaked in politeness, busyness, and vague intentions. It appears not in dramatic explosions, but in subtle patterns that slowly erode the bridge between two people. One of the most telling phrases spoken by a man who is emotionally unavailable is, "I'm just too busy right now." At first glance, this sounds harmless, practical, even responsible. Everyone gets busy. Life pulls us in many directions: career, finances, family obligations. But when this phrase becomes a pattern, when it becomes a rhythm rather than an exception, it is no longer about time management. It is about emotional management. More specifically, the avoidance of emotional intimacy under the disguise of productivity. This phrase is not about schedule. It is about shielding. A man who is emotionally unavailable will use business as a shield, and he may not even realize he is doing it. From a psychological perspective, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for decision-making, often creates justifications that protect deeper emotional wounds stored in the amygdala and limbic system. These justifications become stories. I'll focus on love when work calms down, or she deserves someone who can give her more. On the surface, they appear noble, but underneath, they are strategies, subconscious, yet precise. A woman in her early 50s once shared her story during a retreat. She had been with a man for 7 years. He was kind, driven, and deeply passionate about his career. But every time they talked about emotional depth, marriage, future plans, shared healing, he would retreat into his schedule. "Not this quarter," he would say. "Once I get that promotion." Yet, as the years passed, his emotional distance remained the same. She waited, loved him through his chaos, convinced that being patient was the mark of her own emotional maturity. But patience without presence is not growth, it is neglect in disguise. Neuroscience tells us that emotional intimacy requires attunement. It is the process where one nervous system mirrors another, allowing safety and openness to flow between two people. But this requires time, not just in hours, but in intention. When a man consistently says, "I'm just too busy," what he's truly communicating is, "I cannot attune to you. I cannot meet you where your soul is asking me to meet you." This doesn't make him bad. It makes him unavailable. We live in a world where productivity is praised, often more than presence. But in relationships, presence is the currency of love. Without it, everything else, words, gifts, gestures, becomes hollow. A man who is too busy to be emotionally present is often a man who is afraid of being seen, deeply seen, and being seen requires stillness. Stillness reveals emotional fractures that can no longer be ignored. A gentle example, think of a violinist. His fingers move rapidly, the music flows, the audience is mesmerized. But between every note is a pause, a breath, a moment of stillness. Without the pause, the music becomes noise. The same is true in relationships. Without emotional pause, without the stillness to feel and connect, love becomes performance. Some women internalize the busy excuse as a reflection of their own inadequacy. If I were more interesting, he'd make time. If I were younger, prettier, less demanding. These thoughts are not born from truth. They are born from repeated exposure to distance. But emotional unavailability is not about your worth. It is about his capacity. A man can work 12 hours a day and still be emotionally available. Because presence is not about time, it is about intention. A 5-minute exchange rooted in genuine attention can be more nourishing than hours of distracted proximity. It is essential to see this phrase not just as a statement, but as a decision. I'm just too busy right now, is a decision to prioritize avoidance over connection. And the longer you remain in that space, hoping, bending, rationalizing, the more your own energy starts to scatter. You begin to lose touch with your own emotional rhythm. One woman shared a metaphor that stayed with me. She said, I felt like a plant kept in the dark. I was being watered, but never touched by sunlight. And I realized water isn't enough. I need warmth too. This is the quiet damage of emotional unavailability. It doesn't bruise the skin, but it wilts the spirit. The courage here is not in confronting him. It is in confronting yourself, in asking, why am I accepting this form of connection? What fear keeps me attached to a person who cannot meet me where I am? Often, the answer is rooted in childhood conditioning, where we learned to work hard for love, to prove ourselves worthy of attention, to stay loyal to people who could not reciprocate. These patterns travel with us until we are ready to see them clearly, name them gently, and release them with wisdom. Transitioning from this form of relationship requires emotional sobriety. You must see clearly without the intoxication of hope. You must understand that no amount of waiting, fixing, or performing can turn emotional absence into emotional availability. You must become the river that flows, not the one that waits by the stone, hoping it will move. And when a man says, 5, let's just see where this goes, understand that this, too, is not about openness. It is about hesitation. It is a phrase that sounds adventurous, but is, in truth, an anchor of uncertainty. It leaves the relationship in a permanent state of limbo, a half-formed bond, never fully stepping into vulnerability, never fully committing to clarity. At first, it may feel like freedom. After all, who wants pressure? Who wants rules and rigid expectations? But freedom without direction is disconnection. It leaves you wandering, unsure of how deeply to feel, how much to give, where the boundary lies between hope and self-abandonment. This statement, let's see where this goes, is often said with charm, with warmth. It can feel playful, like an invitation to trust the unfolding. But trust requires evidence, and emotional commitment requires clarity, not comfort. In psychology, this pattern is called ambiguous loss. It occurs when something or someone is emotionally present but unavailable in form or direction. You feel the closeness, yet you are always slightly out of reach. It creates a state of emotional limbo, where you wait, invest, and slowly lose your sense of self in the ambiguity. The truth is, people who genuinely desire emotional connection speak differently. They say, this is how I feel. I want to grow with you. Let's build something meaningful together. Their words are rooted in direction, not drift. Their language mirrors commitment, not convenience. A story comes to mind. A man and woman, both in their 40s, reconnected after years apart. They spent months talking, sharing, opening up. But whenever she brought up the idea of a future, he would say, let's not rush it. Let's just see where it goes. She agreed at first, but slowly, she noticed she was the only one building anything. She would initiate plans, deepen the emotional conversations, hold space for his uncertainty. And eventually, she realized she was carrying both sides of the bridge. This is what happens when you accept uncertain language as a foundation for love. You build on sand. And each time the tide of his indecision rises, you rebuild, hoping next time the ground will hold. But no structure can stand on maybe. From an Eastern perspective, relationships are like gardens. They require intention, attention, and clarity of purpose. You cannot plant seeds and then walk away, telling the soil, let's see what happens. Growth is not accidental. It is the result of mindful tending. In the same way, love must be nurtured by presence and purpose, not by convenience, not by charm. One of the most powerful acts of self-respect is refusing to entertain ambiguous language when your soul is asking for rooted connection. You are not asking for too much when you ask for clarity. You are simply refusing to live in confusion. The deeper question, then, is not why he says these things, but why you believe them. What part of you still fears being alone more than being unclear? What part of your emotional history finds comfort in uncertainty because it mirrors your past? Healing begins when you choose inner clarity over external charm, when you decide that your emotional well-being is no longer negotiable. And from that place, you begin to see. You begin to hear not just the words spoken, but the silences they carry. You begin to trust your body when it tightens at vague statements. You begin to believe your intuition when it says, this is not enough. Letting go of emotionally unavailable patterns is not rejection, it is redirection. It is the act of honoring the sacredness of your emotional landscape. It is choosing the still water over the storm, the rooted tree over the drifting leaf. It is the practice of self-mastery, not in controlling others, but in understanding yourself so deeply that you no longer betray your heart just to feel temporarily connected. And so, whether he says, I'm just too busy right now, or let's just see where this goes, your task is not to wait for a different answer. Your task is to hear the answer already present in his words, and from that knowing, to return home to yourself with wisdom, with clarity, and with peace. There's a quiet form of emotional retreat that is more dangerous than silence. It is the art of subtle deflection. It sounds like care, it looks like concern, but in truth, it is avoidance dressed in reason. You'll recognize it in the words, you're overthinking it. A simple sentence, yet one capable of eroding trust, shaking your confidence, and slowly silencing your emotional intuition. When a man tells you you're overthinking, especially in moments when you are being emotionally vulnerable, what he may actually be doing is protecting himself from emotional accountability. This isn't always malicious. Often it's unconscious, but it still carries weight. It still redirects emotional responsibility away from him and back onto you. It is not a resolution. It's a form of resistance. The nervous system is wired to seek safety. For some, emotional conversations do not feel safe. Vulnerability feels like exposure, and exposure feels like danger. So instead of engaging deeply, they deflect, not by raising their voice or shutting down entirely, but by shifting the focus, subtly, skillfully. And one of the most common tools of this shift is invalidation disguised as logic. You're overthinking it is a phrase that seems rational. It gives the impression that the other person is simply trying to bring perspective, to help you calm down or see things more clearly. But in the context of emotional dialogue, it often implies your feelings are too much, your intuition is a burden, your insight makes me uncomfortable. And so the cycle begins. A woman once shared that she used to pause every time she wanted to express a concern, not because she was unsure of her feelings, but because she had been told so many times that she was reading too much into things. She started second guessing her instincts, editing her expressions, and eventually swallowing her needs. That's the hidden cost of emotional deflection. It trains you to doubt your own emotional intelligence. From a psychological lens, this is known as gaslighting light. It's not the severe, malicious manipulation we often associate with the term. Instead, it's a soft invalidation, subtle enough to seem innocent, yet potent enough to cause inner confusion. It undermines the foundation of emotional intimacy because connection requires acknowledgement, not avoidance. Let's imagine a moment a woman notices that her partner has been distant. Fewer texts, shorter calls, an energy that feels slightly colder than before. She brings it up gently. Lately, I feel like something's shifted between us. Instead of exploring the observation, he responds with a smile. You're overthinking again. You always do this. And in that moment, she feels a familiar tightening in her chest. Not because she believes she's wrong, but because she no longer trusts that her feelings will be received. This is not a failure of communication. It is a failure of emotional presence. When a man cannot sit with the discomfort of your truth, he will try to soften it, edit it, or erase it. And if you are not deeply grounded in your own self-awareness, you will begin to adjust your truth to fit his comfort. There's a teaching in Eastern philosophy as, do not carry water in a broken pot. In the realm of relationships, your emotional expressions are sacred water. They deserve to be held by someone who does not leak, spill, or dismiss them. And yet, so often, we carry our emotions into spaces that cannot hold them. We offer our inner voice to ears that are not ready to hear. And when we are met with deflection, we call it miscommunication instead of misalignment, a powerful practice for anyone who finds themselves repeatedly labeled as overthinking. Is this? Before you question your thoughts, question the space in which you're sharing them. Are you speaking into a container that respects emotion or one that only values logic? Are you being met by a heart or by a shield? This leads naturally into another phrase that is equally deceptive in its emotional posture. You're amazing, but... This statement often arrives wrapped in praise. It feels like a compliment. It appears to be a gesture of admiration. And yet, it carries within it a seed of disconnection, a hidden reservation that is almost always followed by emotional withdrawal. You're amazing, but I'm not ready. You're amazing, but I'm not in the right place. You're amazing, but I don't want to hurt you. Each of these phrases seems noble. They echo maturity, even empathy. But underneath, there is a deeper truth. You are being loved from a distance, admired, but not chosen, seen, but not embraced, held in esteem, but not in intimacy. The contradiction is subtle, but sharp. You are amazing, which implies there is nothing wrong with you. And yet, something is wrong with the connection. So, your mind begins to look for reasons, explanations, cracks that must belong to you. If I am amazing, why am I not enough? Why does he appreciate me but still walk away? This cognitive dissonance becomes emotional tension. You begin to overfunction. You try harder, speak softer, offer more, hoping that your consistent excellence will one day outweigh his inner resistance. But what you're actually doing is participating in a dynamic of intermittent reinforcement, a psychological phenomenon where inconsistent rewards, I like praise followed by withdrawal, create the most addictive emotional bonds. A woman in her 60s once told the story of her 3-year relationship with a man who constantly affirmed her brilliance, but never moved the relationship forward. You're everything I've ever wanted, he'd say, but I'm not ready for something serious. Over time, she began to wonder if love was meant to feel like a waiting room. Every moment spent hoping he'd change, she was slowly changing herself, losing pieces of her power in the process. The reality is this: when a man uses compliments as cushions for his detachment, it's not about you. It's about his own capacity. Emotional intimacy requires risk. To step into it fully, one must be willing to be seen without control, without condition, without certainty. If he cannot take that step, no amount of your amazingness will move him. This is where many fall into the trap of performance-based love. You believe that if you do more, become more, understand more, he will eventually stay. But love that must be earned through excellence is not love, it is approval. And approval is not a solid foundation for emotional intimacy. It is, at best, a fragile agreement. In Eastern teachings, there's the concept of a wu wei, effortless action, flowing with the current of life rather than against it. Real love, when aligned, does not require force. It may require courage, patience, even vulnerability, but not strain, not performing. If you constantly feel the need to prove your worth in order to maintain someone's attention, you are not in love. You are in negotiation, and negotiation leaves little room for rest. "You're amazing, but" is a sentence that often leaves behind emotional residue. Even after the relationship ends or never begins, those words echo. They become internalized. You start to say them to yourself. "I'm amazing, but maybe I'm too much. I'm amazing, but maybe I ask for too much. I'm amazing, but maybe I should just accept less." These are not your truths. They are reflections of someone else's limits. One of the greatest acts of self-honoring is learning to separate someone's perception of you from your perception of self. Just because someone sees your light but cannot walk with you does not mean your light is too bright. It may simply mean their eyes are not ready for what you carry. Emotional deflection and intermittent praise are often used together. One makes you question your clarity. The other makes you crave recognition. Together, they create a loop, a cycle where you stay connected not because you are fulfilled, but because you are addicted to the potential of what could be. But potential is not presence. A relationship rooted in emotional availability does not make you feel like you must filter your feelings. It does not praise you one day and distance itself the next. It does not make you earn what should be freely given: attunement, respect, clarity. To shift out of this dynamic, one must practice emotional discernment. Discernment is not judgment. It is the art of noticing what is spoken, what is withheld, what is consistent, and what is conditional. It is the decision to believe actions over apologies, energy over words, patterns over promises. One woman once shared how she broke the cycle. She had heard all the phrases: "You're too sensitive," "You're amazing, but," "Let's just go with the flow." And then one day, during a meditation retreat, she sat with one question: what does it feel like to be emotionally safe? Not in theory, not in books, but in her body. And her body told her, "It feels like peace, like not having to translate myself, like being able to exhale." From that moment, she stopped settling for almosts. She stopped being the one who initiated all the emotional conversations. She stopped interpreting withdrawal as mystery. And in doing so, she found not just another partner, but herself. Self-mastery in relationships begins when you stop trying to decode emotional ambiguity and start responding to it with truth. When you stop adjusting your voice to be heard and begin listening to the silence it is met with. When you release the need to be amazing in order to be loved and instead seek to be seen just as you are in both your softness and strength. Emotional unavailability is not a puzzle to solve. It is a pattern to recognize. And once you see it, you do not need to fight it. You simply need to flow around it like the river and keep flowing toward clarity, toward peace, toward love that does not require a but to be spoken. There is a particular kind of phrase that sounds simple but reveals everything. A man looks into your eyes and says, "That's just how I am." These words may be delivered calmly, without confrontation. In fact, they may come with a gentle smile or a tone of resignation. But listen carefully, not to the words, but to what they imply. This phrase is not an explanation, it is a declaration. It signals the end of growth, the closure of adaptability, the locking of emotional doors. When someone utters those 5 words in response to your emotional needs or boundaries, what they're really saying is, "Do not expect change from me. This is the limit of my participation." Relationships are not static structures. They are living ecosystems. They breathe, evolve, and stretch to accommodate the truth of 2 people walking together through life. When one partner plants himself in the soil of rigidity, he refuses to participate in that growth. And when that rigidity is disguised as identity, it becomes even harder to challenge. "That's just how I am" masquerades as authenticity, but more often, it is the armor of avoidance. Growth asks for courage. The courage to be uncomfortable, to face the parts of ourselves that were once necessary for survival, but now hinder connection. Not everyone is ready for that. Not everyone is willing to examine their own defenses, their habits, their inherited beliefs. So, instead, they protect those parts with labels. They wear them like badges of honor. "I'm just not good at communication. I don't do emotions. I need space when things get hard." These statements are not truths. They are walls. Walls that have been reinforced over time by family conditioning, past traumas, and the societal narrative that equates masculinity with detachment. But a wall, no matter how well constructed, still blocks light, and you standing on the other side start to feel the chill. You begin to wonder if asking for emotional presence makes you unreasonable. You begin to feel small in your desires for connection. That is how emotional stagnation works. It convinces you that your needs are the problem. A woman in her early 40s once described her relationship with a man who was, in her words, deeply principled, but emotionally paralyzed. Every time she invited him into a deeper conversation about their bond, their future, their struggles, he would retreat behind the phrase, "This is just who I am. I don't do emotional conversations." And at first, she admired his consistency. She believed that stability was better than uncertainty. But over time, she began to realize that what she mistook for emotional consistency was actually emotional avoidance. She wasn't in a relationship with a person. She was in a relationship with a fixed idea of who he claimed to be. The irony is that identity is not meant to be fixed. It is meant to be fluid. Just as water adapts to the shape of its container, the human spirit is meant to evolve with the demands of intimacy. In truth, the statement, "That's just how I am," reveals a deeper fear, the fear of vulnerability, of shedding the old armor, of stepping into emotional spaces without the familiar shields. But fear disguised as identity creates distance, and distance, over time, leads to disconnection. From a psychological perspective, this behavior is often linked to what's known as a fixed mindset. The belief that one's traits, behaviors, and emotional capacities are permanent and unchangeable. This mindset resists feedback, avoids challenge, and clings to certainty. It offers the illusion of control, but it comes at the cost of relational depth. True intimacy cannot flourish in a fixed mindset because intimacy demands evolution. It demands a willingness to say, "I may not know how yet, but I am willing to try." It is natural to feel compassion for someone who clings to old patterns. After all, we all have wounds that shaped us. But compassion does not mean tolerance of stagnation. You can love someone and still recognize that their unwillingness to grow is slowly dimming your light. You can understand their pain without carrying it, and you can honor their journey without sacrificing your own. In Eastern teachings, there is a principle that says the bamboo that bends is stronger than the oak that resists. Flexibility is not weakness. It is a sign of resilience, of spiritual maturity. In relationships, the ability to bend, to adapt, to listen, to transform is what allows love to endure through change. But when a person wraps their rigidity in the language of identity, they are choosing resistance over relationship. A woman once wrote in her journal, "I kept trying to teach him how to meet me, but he kept reminding me that he never learned how and wasn't planning to." That single line captures the emotional fatigue of being in a relationship with someone who uses "that's just how I am" as both a sword and a shield. It wears you down not through conflict, but through passivity, through the slow erosion of hope. And yet there is something even more subtle, more complex, that emerges in such dynamics. It is the paradoxical statement, "I care about you. I just can't be what you need." This sentence seems self-aware. It appears to acknowledge limitations. It sounds like kindness. But what it really does is leave you suspended between affection and abandonment. When someone tells you they care, but cannot show up, what they are offering is a relationship in theory, not in practice. They are giving you the warmth of emotion, but withholding the structure of commitment. This creates a very specific type of pain, the pain of almost loved, almost chosen, almost seen. And that pain lingers longer than rejection because it keeps you tethered to a fantasy, one where they might one day step into the full version of themselves and meet you where you've been waiting. There's a story about a man who stood outside a temple every day praying to be allowed inside. The temple had no door. It was open. But he never stepped in. He stood just beyond the threshold, hands folded, whispering his prayers. When asked why, he said, "I respect the temple too much to enter unprepared." And so he remained outside day after day, never realizing that reverence without participation is still absence. When a man says, "I care about you, but I can't be what you need," he often believes he's being noble. He doesn't want to cause harm. He doesn't want to make promises he can't keep. But noble intentions don't erase emotional consequences. Caring without commitment is like watering a plant without sunlight. It may stay alive, but it will never bloom. The truth is, emotional availability is not measured by sentiment. It is measured by action. Do they show up? Do they engage? Do they make space for your pain, your joy, your complexity? Or do they withdraw behind poetic language and philosophical explanations for their distance? A woman once said, "He told me he loved me with his soul, but he couldn't love me with his schedule." And in that statement, she revealed the core contradiction. We do not live in each other's souls. We live in time, in presence, in shared decisions. A love that lives only in theory does not feed the heart. It feeds the illusion. This dynamic is particularly dangerous because it teaches you to settle for half truth, half effort, half presence. It teaches you to find nourishment in crumbs. And over time, you begin to mistake longing for love. But longing is not love. It is the echo of love, and echoes cannot hold you. There is wisdom in accepting someone's limitations, but there is greater wisdom in recognizing when those limitations are being used to excuse withdrawal. "I care about you, but I can't be what you need," is not a declaration of love. It is a boundary, one that defines the perimeter of their emotional reach. And once you hear it, your task is not to try and stretch it. Your task is to ask yourself, am I willing to shrink myself to fit within these lines? Spiritual maturity in relationships means choosing partners who don't just admire your depth, but are willing to meet it. Who don't just care in words, but in action. Who don't just notice your need, but seek to understand it, to hold it, to grow with it. In Eastern philosophy, there is the understanding that true connection is not about perfection, but participation. You do not need a partner who is flawless. You need one who is willing to learn your rhythm, willing to face their own resistance, willing to move beyond their old identity, not for you, but with you. And when someone tells you, "I can't be what you need," hear them, not with bitterness, but with clarity, not as a challenge, but as a signpost. The road ahead may still be filled with care, even affection, but it is not a road that leads to shared evolution. And so, you must decide whether the scenery of what is almost is worth the sacrifice of what could be. Not all hearts are ready. Not all souls are prepared to travel into the depths of intimacy. But if you are one who seeks depth, truth, and transformation, then you must learn to walk away not only from pain, but from partial presence, from care that does not become commitment, from affection that does not translate into action. There is a profound dignity in letting go of a connection that lacks readiness. And in doing so, you do not lose love. You preserve your capacity for it. You do not abandon hope. You protect it from erosion, and you do not give up on connection. You simply return to the one connection that must always be intact, the one you hold with yourself. Emotional unavailability does not always arrive in the form of silence or absence. Sometimes it comes cloaked in language that seems gentle, even thoughtful. Phrases like, "I'm just too busy right now. Let's see where this goes. You're overthinking it. You're amazing, but that's just how I am." Or, "I care about you, but I can't be what you need." Each of these statements, when examined with clarity and honesty, points not to a lack of love, but to a lack of readiness, presence, and emotional depth. True connection is not built on vague promises or poetic affection. It is built on presence, consistent, grounded, and mutual. It is built on a willingness to grow, to be seen, and to take responsibility for the emotional impact we have on others. When someone is emotionally unavailable, their words